beginning with verse 11. It'll be verses 11 through, I believe it's 17. Yes, through 17, we'll be looking at one of those stories that I've learned since I was a kid that I think has very important meaning today. Remember, this continues on with a series we've been on for a while now of God working through the little bitty people. Actually, this is the ordinary becoming extraordinary. If everybody's caught up with me, we'll begin reading here from verse 11 here of Luke chapter 7. And it says, "Now it happened the day after that he went into a city called Nain. And many of his disciples went with him, and a large crowd. And when he came near the gate of the city, behold, a dead man was being carried out, the only son of his mother. And she was a widow, and a large crowd from the city was with her. And when the Lord saw her, he had compassion on her, and he said to her, 'Do not weep.' Then he came and he touched the open coffin, and those who carried him stood still. And he said, 'Young man, I say to you, arise.' So he who was dead sat up, and he began to speak. And he presented him to his mother. And then fear came upon all and they glorified God, saying, 'A great prophet has risen up among us, and God has visited his people.' And this report about him went throughout all Judea and all the surrounding regions." Now, I tried to lay all the background last week of the culture and what's going on. It still comes into play today if you remember nothing else from that, and remembering the rituals of the funerals we looked at were in their funeral that day. We've got the mother put in front. The mother or the wife would always be put in front because they blamed her for death entering the world. So she had to march in front of the crowd. This open coffin that this translation she uses, anybody in the King James sees that word here as a bier. We call it a pallet or a flat cot today. He's carried on it. That's carried by the family members. And as they go down the road, rather than them pulling over and turning their lights on and all these other things, people will join the crowd and it become bigger and bigger. Then here at the wall, here at the gate to this little city called Nain, we've got two crowds coming together because Jesus has been healing. He's just left Capernaum. He's coming back to the south of Galilee, and all these miracles and all these teachings and all these people coming from the Sermon on the Mount and other things are following. When we have these two large crowds that meet up with Jesus and this poor widow meeting face to face. I tried to at least lay that background last week, and then I wanted you to see this point. My biggest point, and I want to carry that on today from last week, was I asked my question. I gave you like 5 questions, but the biggest one I tried to lay to you last week, and the Bible doesn't clearly answer this one, but what would this young man have died from? There's much commentary, there's much reading. Y'all who have these big study Bibles, there's probably a lot in there about widows and what a poor sick this widow was all in here, but nothing I can read, nobody I see anywhere ever talks about the boy. We know he's a young man, and we know he was dead, and we know he was in the middle of his own funeral, and beyond that, we basically don't know anything about him. And I said, I can't say for that day, but if we looked at the day and the time and the culture we live in, the greatest chance, and that would be, I believe it was 1 in 4, if my memory's correct, chance that he would have died of a heart condition. And we took that and looked at the spiritual conditions that block us out. I literally gave you 11 of them last week that lead to two types of a heart attack, that lead to 2 circumstances, one of them being the isolated heart, the next being the hardened heart, that ultimately wind up killing us spiritually, that ultimately wind up blocking us off and taking what God meant for us and what God designed for us and what God intended to flow through us from the life-giving breath of the Holy Spirit, and literally being blocked off and dying in the process of it. And that's where we left off last week. So as I carry on from that, one quick thing that I want to use to open to this one this week is with that same mindset. I want you to get the picture right here to think of this today. The quickest mindset that I usually give to this spiritual death that I see going on so often and so regular that I've even experienced in my own life. I often have many years I've equated it to a tooth. Now, you think about it for a minute. Everybody here has probably had a toothache at some point in life. God's really blessed you if you hadn't. But so many times we find these issues with a tooth, and I've actually know that one person that this has been fatal with. I know of two others that has come very, very close. But of all the other issues with cavities, and I read up on some of that, so I never knew there was so many results from cavities. Man, it's scary, all the way from brain infections to jaw infections. I mean, it's scary what all these things do. But sometimes it happens, and I know of at least 3 cases I've been around personally where it has happened. One of them died, and there becomes what was the name of it? A root tip infection is the name of it, and literally the root of the tooth becomes abscessed and becomes infected. But where it's at on that root, you never even know it. They never even feel it. And what it does at some point in time, and they really don't understand why, it begins to produce this infection. And what does it do? It goes straight to the heart. And it begins to damage and it begins to kill the heart. And you say, I see that going on with our own country. I see it going on in our own ways. And the thing I get to is this, because I see it so often in our own country. The thing that I see going over and over again, we just want to brush our own tooth. We want to do this, but there has to be a deeper work. There has to be something bigger going on than what we can do with our own hands. And see, within that result, it takes one thing. It takes a dentist who can drill down and get to the root of the problem. The root that often we won't admit to ourselves. The root that has caused the infection to enter us. And you see, oddly enough, I read a phrase here about 2 weeks ago from one of the greatest most respected, don't let me use the word greatest, evolutionists who ever lived. Y'all may remember he died not long ago. This was actually on a memorial to him. His name was Richard Dawkins. And he was asked this question. He asked, and actually they said it originated with one of his students. And the great philosophers are still debating it right now. But he was asked this question from a student where he was a professor, I believe it was in London. And he was asked, if we evolved from this ape and whatever other story they've invented this week of how we supposedly became from a bug to a monkey to a man. And in this process, if we all evolved and took this process and became this great evolved being that evolved, why don't we still have good and evil? Why do we have good people who do good things and help others and care for others and sacrifice themselves? And then why do we have evil people that take up a gun and walk into a school and shoot 12 other people? And it went on and on with evil. And Richard Dawkins gave one answer, and I never dreamed I would agree with a fool such as this man. But on this point, he was right. He said there's only one explanation for good and evil from a scientific point of view. And he said every person that does evil says they have contracted a virus. He said, now this is an undetected virus that we've yet to understand. He said, but they have contracted a virus, and this virus controls them, and it makes them do evil things that we can't understand and that we don't know. And it's like, this man is almost right. Because the Bible's told us this for 2,000 years now. We've each contracted a virus, and it's not one good and one evil, but it's all evil, and it calls that virus sin. And that sin takes place in our lives. That place gets down there deep, and it starts taking effects that we never know, and it isolates our hearts from our family members. It isolates our hearts from our friends. It isolates our hearts from Jesus. It isolates our hearts from our church. Suddenly we can put up fences, and we can put up walls, and we can build bank accounts, and we can separate each other, and the next thing we know, we come up with a hard heart that even the Word of God won't touch. Notice here, these two crowds come together. We have one crowd seeking life. We have another crowd seeking death. We have more people seeking death in our society today than we have ever had. And there's one answer to it. Notice verse 13 right there. And he had compassion on her. You see, what we find here is not an ordinary compassion. You see, I have compassion on people. I have compassion on friends. But the compassion of a God who does this, a compassion of a God who would leave heaven and come to a mud hole, who would walk up to this poor widow in one of the worst cases I've ever seen in life. We can't understand that. That goes beyond comprehension. There's not a scientific formula that says this is how that happens. Literally, it becomes what we see the first work of what the Bible calls grace. You see, all have sinned and fallen short of the glory of God. Romans 3:23. I would hope every adult here has memorized that as much as you hear it. But how many can tell you what verse 24 says? See, we always drop off right there. That's the number one point in leading someone to Christ is Romans 3:23. I can do it in my sleep. But everybody misses verse 24. See, Romans 3:24 says this, being justified freely by his grace through the redemption that is in us in Christ Jesus. You see, his grace was working before we ever knew it. But the first work of grace we see is his compassion. Compassion of a God who could have let us just go in our own way, in our own will, and let us perish as we deserved. But yet he comes, and he comes to this little bitty woman right here. And it's something hard to understand. You know, from when I was a boy, I can't remember, but I wasn't very old. My mom will testify to this. My best friends when I was a kid were my hunting dogs. And I heard this from some old man hunting at some point in my life. And I'm sure it's not true, but they always told it that it is. And every time I've read this story since a boy, I've thought of this. I've thought of this story, and it said that a man had a favorite coonhound, and he hunted all the time. And his wife, she had her favorite cat, and the cat stayed in her house. Well, kind of like I got two cats running my house, and this cat just ruled over the house. And the dog and the cat didn't get along, and the husband and the wife didn't get along because of the cat. And anyway, he had to go away on business for 3 or 4 days. Well, he comes back home from business, and as he walks up on the porch, there's old Blue laying there, and here's the old cat, old long-haired Persian cat, and he looks, and the thing's just dirt and mud and nasty all over, and old Blue's got it down here in his mouth, and he's holding it in his mouth, and he's licking it, and all over, and he looks, and here's the old cat, and the cat's dead. And he's like, oh man, I'm going to be dead too. Old Blue's done caught this cat, he done killed it, and she's going to kill me in just a minute. So the husband, in a panic, he takes the cat up and he runs into the kitchen and he washes it and he cleans it up real good and gets it all fluffy and pretty and blow dried. And then he takes it over here to her little bed in the edge of the kitchen and he lays it right there, and then he goes on about his business. He goes back out in the yard, and directly he's working out in the yard, and all of a sudden he sees his wife. She's screaming to the top of her lungs. What in the world has happened? And he hears her. She's just in a panic. So he comes running in the house, and she's pointing and she's looking, and she can barely even speak. And he says, oh, baby, I'm so sorry your cat died. She says, don't worry, we can find you another cat. And she finally gets the words, and she says, no, not that. She said, he died 2 days ago. She said, I buried him in the backyard. How did he get back here? You see, literally, we see that with Jesus Christ. We see the people surrounding here looking at Jesus Christ. How did this happen? Dead men don't come back to life. This guy's been washed. This guy's been through the rituals. This guy's in the middle of his funeral. This doesn't happen. This is beyond anything ordinary. This is beyond extraordinary. This can't be comprehended. How can this happen? It blows her explanation, and there's only one explanation. It's the compassion of a God who loves us. It's the compassion of a God who not only can drill down into your life and fix that bitter heart and that hard heart and that isolated heart and that weak heart and that needy heart and that grumpy heart and all those others that we looked at last week. But it's a God that even rules over death. You see Paul write this much later to the Corinthians when he says, oh, death, wore out our sting. You see, here's a God that has a compassion that goes beyond what I understand. You know, read with me just a second. I find no place better in the Bible than the last time Jesus does this. He does this 3 times. The last one we'll find in John chapter 11. Beginning with verse 39, Jesus says this, and Jesus said, take away the stone. And Martha, the sister of him who was dead, being Lazarus, said, Lord, by this time there's a stench, and he's been dead for 4 days. And Jesus said to her, did I not say to you, if you would believe, you would see the glory of God? Then they took away the stone from the place. And when the dead man was lying, and Jesus lifted up his eyes, and he said, Father, I thank you, for you have heard me. And I know that you always hear me, but because of this people who are standing by, I said this, that you may believe that you sent me. And now when he said these things, he cried with a loud voice, and Lazarus came forth. And he who died came out, bound hand and foot with grave cloths, and his face was wrapped with a cloth. And Jesus said to him, loose him and let him go. Then many of the Jews who had come to Mary and had seen these things Jesus did believed in him. Now, don't miss the important thing. There's a whole lot right here. But Jesus tells us 2 reasons that he did this. Catch them right here. Don't miss these very big reasons right here. The first reason, look at at verse 45 right there. Many of the Jews who had come to Mary and had said these things in Jesus believed in him. You see, he did this for one reason. What did he say up there in verse 42? You always hear me, but because of the people who are standing by, I said this, that you may believe he whom you have sent. You see, Jesus did this for one reason, because, see, he doesn't see good in evil people. He sees all evil people. I wish Richard Dawkins would have understood that before he died and went to hell. You see, we look at it as this guy's good, this guy's bad, this guy's black, this guy's white, this guy's rich, this guy's poor, and all these other things. Jesus sees one thing. He who has believed is not condemned. John 3:19. Who has not believed is condemned already. He has my child and not my child. There is no other division. There is no other separation. There is nothing else that matters. And this poor child in Luke 7 has died. This poor man in Lazarus is already buried. He's already in the grave. And he's done this so that we would believe. But don't notice one other thing about it right here. Verse 44. What does he say whenever he brings him back to life? See him and let him go. Let me ask you this morning. How many of us here this morning have come to Jesus? We've known about him. Some of you known about him longer than I've been alive. And Jesus is faithful and just to do just exactly what he says he will do. But how many of us this morning are still wearing those grave clothes? You see, some of you this morning, when he found you, you were disobedient, you were proud in your heart, and you were a mean rascal. Hey, that one applies to me, brother. You know, let me ask you this one this morning. How many of you this morning, when Jesus Christ found you, you had that isolated heart, that heart that was so mad at their neighbor they couldn't talk about them, that heart that sat in the bed at night and hated their boss because their boss gave them orders, that same hard heart that I read every time I go on Facebook about how somebody's always done me wrong, but that same isolated heart that can never get over what somebody done for me last week. They come back, what did you do for me today? They forgot what you did last week. You know, that same heart that is blocked off, that same heart that can never ever see what God did for them. And what even becomes more dangerous than that, the most dangerous grave clothes that I see worn today is the hard heart. It has set in place. It has went back and forth and back and forth and back and forth. It's never changed. I'll give you this example again because I learned this from a medical doctor at the University of Medical Center years ago in one of his lectures in college. He was a man with polio. And he leaned on a stick. He was crippled on his left side, but his right hand was good. And he said, if I lay my right hand on this podium and I leave it here, he said in 4 to 6 minutes, it begins to go to sleep. I begin to get the pins and I begin to get the needles and I begin to not be able to feel it anymore. But he said, if I leave it there, I believe it was 12 to 14 minutes. He said, eventually those feelings quit and those feelings become numb. And I don't even have any feeling left in my hand. He said, but if I continue to leave that hand right there and I get up to, I believe it was 22 to 25 minutes, he said, literally my brain forgets that my hand is there. My brain forgets that I even have a hand, and it forgets how to move it and how to control it until I begin to restore that motion again. And the most dangerous, most deadly thing that I find within our society today is just that within the bonds of our society, we have forgotten what God done, and we have set in our inaction, and we have set in our apathy, and we have set within our hard, isolated hearts for so long, we have forgotten even who God is. We'll tattoo him on our arm, but we'll never let his law come into our heart. We'll love him in the middle of church, and then we'll go get drunk before it gets dark. We'll leave the church empty this morning, but I can go to the river and find 5,000 people this evening with $100,000 worth of four-wheelers. We'll leave his church empty, but we'll fill NFL up. Why? Because we have forgotten who he is. We've forgotten what he's done. We want an ordinary compassion when we're in trouble. We want to help when we're laid off. We want a doctor when we're sick. We want our children educated, but we don't care what kind of filth they pump in their mind when they do the same thing. We want an ordinary compassion, but with an extraordinary compassion that changes everything we look at, that radically reviews how we see the earth, that radically changes how I relate to other people, that radically changes how I spend my life, that radically changes how I view God, that makes me love God more than the NFL, that makes me love my Bible more than my four-wheeler, that lets me love my place in His kingdom and my service to Him more than I love my deer stand. We simply leave that sitting there and can't even feel it anymore. Don't even know it anymore. Isolated, hard hearts that are in need for a touch from the one who can heal them this morning. Let me close you one story, as I'm about out of time on this one. Man, there's so much to tell about this guy, I don't know where to start. But how many have ever heard of a man named Dr. David Livingston? One of the greatest servants I've ever read of in the 1800s. If any of you have heard of the country of Africa, most equate it, but we heard of it because of him. He served there for more years than I can remember now. Literally, he was 60 years old in 1853. May 1st, 1853, if I'm not mistaken. And he had served there so long, and he had been through so much with the people there that he had joined and he had bonded. He had had compassion on those people, and he had brought Christ to them and done many, many other things there. But he had worked so hard with those people that he had contracted malaria. He could contracted dysentery and 4 or 5 other things. And even when he had chances to go back home, even when he could have went back and got medical care, he said, no, I'll stay with my people. And literally on May 1st, 1853, he died. He had imparted so much to these people as they prepared his body to send him back to England. He's buried at Westminster Abbey, I believe that's in London now. What did they do before they shipped him back? The chief of that village, now we call that village, it was Rhodesia at the time. I forget what the name of it is now. But literally that chief of Rhodesia, he had his servants go and remove David Livingston's heart. And they buried his heart under the biggest tree they had in the village. And they made monuments to him on the village. And it was an order to the people in that village that every time that a new member came to that village, that they had to take them to that tree and they had to tell them what David Livingston did for them. Tell me something this morning. That's a dead man's heart that's buried in the dark. Jesus Christ gave us His heart alive. God sent the very flesh of His body, the very pumping blood of His soul to me and you. How many of us have left it sitting out there and let it go cold? How many of us this morning have become what us Baptists love to call backsliding, and then go back and eat supper this evening and forget about how far we slid back? How many of us have become isolated and cold and allowed that gift that God raised to sit in one place so long it doesn't matter anymore? You see, that's the deadliest thing that I find in our society today. As Matt Chandler put it, those who call themselves Christians who simply are not. Whether they used to be or not, I leave that for somebody smarter than me to argue about. But by the actions and by the way they live their life today, Christ simply does not matter anymore. I asked you this morning, how many of you need that extraordinary compassion? I can give you my testimony and show you how even that dead, cold heart that could care if He's there anymore, He can bring it back to life. And I would like to bring you that compassion this morning as Ryan comes for an invitation. I didn't even look to see what it was, but he'll tell you here in just a second. But I asked you to look for just a second, because see, just like that tooth I mentioned a while ago, in my own life, this was something I found hid. If you asked me I was saved, I'd have said, yeah. But the truth is, I'd have busted hell open with a big cannonball, guy. The truth is, I even hid this from myself. The truth is, this blocked me off. And what God tried to pour into my life and into my marriage and into my family and into my church and everything else for me, I let this come through and simply create a spiritual heart attack that I would have never survived but for His grace and for His compassion. I offer you that same compassion this morning. There's no sinner so great He can't reach you, but you got to let Him reach you. Go ahead, brother.